Hello. Yeah. So a very good evening to everyone here. Delighted and honored by the presence of a lot of people I hold in very high esteem, and my mother too. It's a privilege on so many counts, a moment of great fulfillment, a moment of great pride to be in conversation with an old student who has since been more of a peer, an intellectual, if you like, interlocutor, somebody I've had very interesting conversations, and particularly so in view of his proven scholarship and erudition. I cannot say enough how much I've learned from this book, which is the subject of our discussion today. And as I humorously but with all honesty mentioned to Sukalyan, the author, a little while back, I've been taking frantic notes. So it's been an uncommon reading experience, and I'm fully aware of the appositeness of the word experience in this context. I don't know what qualifies me to be here, formally speaking, to be talking about this book. I don't think simply the fact that I've served Visva-Bharati for now, well, over 20 years, I don't think that fact in itself is qualification for the function that I am here, as it were, performing. I think Santiniketan is so much more than Visva-Bharati, and with some, there are porosities, there are overlaps, there are intersections, as we shall in course of this hour discuss, but there are also, as it were, divergences. So I'm acutely aware of the fact that I am serving Visva-Bharati. And the other aspiration, of course, is always also to imbibe, inculcate, and to, as it were, absorb the larger experience of Santiniketan as a kind of an ideal of lived experience. In that capacity, too, Sukalyan is somebody I'm continually learning from, because he is not just a researcher, a scholar, somebody who has kind of been reared by Santiniketan and its lived experience. So he is also a young ashramik in every sense of the term. I'd like to think that he's also a practitioner of certain ideals, certain, if you like, aesthetic, spiritual, pedagogic, and cultural, if you like, ways of contributing to the sense of a community, the idea of a community. And that is also something that I would like to celebrate here. That's what we are here to talk about. So after that long preamble, let me perhaps begin or get the discussion underway with a question for Sukalyan, the opening one, as it were, and it relates perhaps logically to the title of the book. You call it a poet's ashram. So why did you decide to call it, or why would you think that your emphasis fell on, if I'm reading right, on the concept of this being an ashram that was created by a poet?
Thank you, Ananya. It was a very generous introduction. Thank you for your kind words. I would also like to thank Suresh Omiya Memorial Trust for giving us this opportunity to talk about this book. The title is important in that I have always felt that Rabindranath's ashram was meant to be different from the other conventional ashrams that existed in contemporary India. And I mean, after all, he cannot be classed as one of those conventional gurus around whom a group of disciples gather. And he was also self-consciously aware of the fact that it was not just an experiment in creating a real institution or a set of institutions, but also an idea that was shaped and reshaped through a process of imagining. So the imagination was an important part of the process of evolution. And he himself mentions that it has been a part of his creative self. It has been a part of his own life's evolution. He also mentions that it can be regarded as a work of art, kabbo. So in trying to define his ashram as a kind of work of art, he was making a distinction between his ashram and the conventional educational institutions that functioned mechanically. The machine is another important metaphor in his writings. So he's making a distinction between a kind of work of art, a kind of poem that is being written through a process of imagining, and the conventional educational institutions that are governed by rigid rules. And secondly, he was also aware of the fact that it was different from the other ashrams. On the one hand, he was profoundly influenced and inspired by classical Sanskrit literary descriptions of the ashramas of ancient India. He was always an admirer of Kalidas's plays. And in several of his writings, he acknowledges that the plays, that the Topobon portrayed in these plays is, in a sense, an ideal. So the historicity of the real ashrams of the past is somehow less important than the fact that these were also ideas that were being articulated through literature. These were also products of poetic imagination. So in a sense, he was trying to connect his own effort to create an imagined community with that poetic imagination which manifests itself through works of literature, but also it is something that has a real presence in the real world. He was also aware that his ashram was similar to some of the other experimental ashram communities that were being founded in early 20th century India. For example, the ashrams founded by Gandhi, or the ashram founded by Sri Aurobindo in Pondicherry. But it was also fundamentally different because of its emphasis on certain principles like creativity, joyfulness in learning. All these ashrams had different priorities, whereas Gandhi's ashram focused on the social and political movements he led. Sri Aurobindo's ashram was predominantly concerned with a certain kind of yoga that aimed to introduce and disseminate a new level of consciousness. But the poet's ashram was more, in his understanding, it was more like an organic being that was constantly evolving in creative ways. And that is why I think a poet's ashram, these words, this title, makes a distinction between what Rabindranath was trying to achieve in Santiniketan and Siniketan and the other experimental communities, the other educational institutions, or even the other ashrams that existed at that point of time in India.
Thank you very much. As I listened to you, I remembered something that you so astutely in context state. I'd like to perhaps correct my own use of verb. When you say that Visva-Bharati was registered as a society, whereas Santiniketan, the ashram that you have been, as it were, talking about and you've written about, is a community. So that I think that difference of nomenclature is very, very significant. And just tells us how refined, how nuanced Rabindranath's understanding of and perhaps imbibition of a wide-ranging spectrum of perhaps parallel, partly synonymous, coterminous concepts would have been. And he's so cosmopolitan. I mean, as I read your book, I was thinking about the fact that it could have been, it is not, it certainly emphatically was not, but why is it that it's not a commune? Why is it that it's not a society? For instance, I was thinking about Amar Kutir. I often think in terms of the continuities. So there's an Amar Kutir cooperative society, but you call this ashram. So I think a philological inquiry is also can be very rich and I think you've drawn upon that in so many ways. And I also I was struck by the fact that you bring out so cogently the decolonizing and the decolonial nature of the project. It's a decolonial project, ultimately. It's not a post-colonial or an anti-colonial project. And you use the word anti-colonial perhaps about Gandhiji's ashrams, Shiva Ashram and the Sabarmati one, I believe, the Satyagraha Ashram. But this is a decolonial project, so much, as it were, ahead of our time when we are so preoccupied and exercised by decolonization at so many levels, pedagogy and so much else. So that dichotomy of the community and the society is something that I was particularly struck by. So in that context, let me also alert you to your own use of and a recurrent use, almost as a kind of catchphrase, if that's not an unfashionable word in research terminology, which is the experimental community. So you have the qualifier experiment. What would you have to say about that? And I might have certain further questions on that score. Experimental community. Why would you say it's an experimental one?
Well, I have tried to argue that through his ashram, Rabindranath was quite self-consciously trying to imagine not just a system of education, but also a way of living and also a certain kind of community. And that idea of a community was firmly rooted in his critique of certain aspects of modern Western culture and colonial modernity in particular. For example, the commercialism, the materialism of modern urban existence, the inequalities and hierarchies that existed in colonial India in terms of caste, class, religion, and also the rigid, illiberal ideologies that separate human beings from one another. So he was, from the very beginning, self-consciously trying to imagine an alternative community. An alternative community, a kind of space where an alternative way of being could take shape. So if we look at the letters he wrote to, for example, Jagadish Chandra Bosu or Kunjalal Ghosh, or even later Ajit Chakraborty, we see that there is this conscious effort to create an exemplary community that would perhaps provide a model, not just for an emergent new India, but also for the world. And and Rabindranath, along with his ideological allies throughout the world, were conscious of the importance, the political, social, cultural relevance of this effort. So, for example, to Paul Geheb, the German pedagogue, he writes that institutions like my Santiniketan and your school, which was called Odenwald School, and later he founded another school, École des Humanités, School of Mankind. These institutions can play an important role in creating a new world where a new set of values will replace the politics of conflict, the politics of exclusion, for example. So, from the very beginning, from the Brahmacharya phase onwards, he was consciously and constantly consciously aware of the experimental nature of this project. And he was also aware of the gulf between the ideal and the real. Since it is an experiment, it was evolving in completely unpredictable, through a completely unpredictable trajectory. So he was conscious of the gap between the ideal and the real, but at the same time, somehow he always felt that the ideal was no less important than the real, that it somehow worked, sometimes it worked imperceptibly within the minds of the people who participated in the experiment. And whether the experiment was successful or not is a question that he himself anticipates sometimes and also tries to answer that. And his answer is this, that it's impossible to measure the amount of success achieved by an institution or community like this. So it is probably working silently within the minds of these people. And yes, as you rightly pointed out, it was an anti-colonial space. From the very beginning, it was meant to be an institution that countered the epistemic violence that was perpetrated by the colonial state through its education system.
You talk about how it was not looked upon favorably by the colonial government.
Yes.
So
Yes, it was
subjected
constantly
to
under
espionage and
surveillance. Yes, if you look at the police files, we realize that that the poet himself, even after the Nobel Prize, he was constantly under police surveillance. And the very idea of trying to find a way of being which was based on authentic Indian values, the very idea of trying to create a space that would be different from, that would provide something that was different from colonial modernity, was definitely something that the colonial rulers suspected, that they distrusted. So yes, from 1901 to 1941, during all these decades, it was, in a way, an anti-colonial space. It challenged colonial rule through its attempt to find an alternative modernity, which was based on India's civilizational inheritance, and which, of course, meant a selective appropriation of certain values. He was never blindly revivalist. He chose to focus on certain ethical values that he thought were politically and socially relevant in his own time. For example, I have repeatedly mentioned that the spiritual basis of the ashram was in his personal reading of the Upanishadic notion of universal unity, which was a spiritual idea.
Unity as opposed to uniformity.
Yes, absolutely. Unity as opposed to uniformity. And he translated that spiritual idea into a social and political doctrine, which emphasized the importance of unity, collaboration, inclusivity. And he tried to translate these values into praxis through his own ashram. And in the realm of art, in the realm of architecture, in the realm of the ashram's foundational values, there was an attempt to find, to invent or reinvent something that was authentically Indian. And the question of self-respect was also therefore important, because the idea was to demonstrate that India also could rediscover its own cultural, civilizational, spiritual resources and make those resources available to the world, and therefore boost its own self-respect and the respect of the world, including the colonizing nation.
Yeah. Yes, I can now make a connection between the radio address that you mentioned in the book in 1930, where he talks about Santiniketan as a work of art, and the kind of synthesis and syncretism of, on multiple levels, multifocal syncretism and synthesis, that Santiniketan presented him with an opportunity to experiment with. So on that question of experimentation, I was particularly struck by it, because you see it kind of introduces a completely new dimension, if you like. It redefines the idea of the scientific experiment. That's why there was a certain kind of oxymoronic contradiction or tension between the two words, you know. That's what I was trying to insinuate. Because experiment is always something that's predicated upon a sense, you know, kind of controlled
Yes.
Ordering of conditions. So some things have to be constant to see whether the other, where the variables, how they react or behave, and so on. Whereas here, and you so aptly developed upon that right now, when you said that this was an experiment in the sense that he allowed the community to define itself as though it were nature, as though it were something organic, as opposed to controlled. So the control works in terms of kind of setting things moving, but it's not control in the sense of, if you like, predetermining the outcome, or if you like, kind of fixing the outcome for any continuous or continual period of time. So that's the wonderful, that's really what perhaps makes Santiniketan so much of a living ideal.
His favorite metaphor was the metaphor of the tree or the plant which grows organically.
Exactly.
Yes.
So it's not a museum, it's not an archive, it's not essentially just heritage either. It is something that...
It's a living space.
It's a living space. But not a living space in the sense of something that's tied down to a particular geographical, if you like, locus.
Right.
It's also a conceptual space. So there's so much, that's fascinating kind of tension and almost a kind of symbiosis between the experimental qualifier, the qualifier experimental, and that which it's qualifying, that which it kind of engendered, which is the community in practice.
Yes.
Were you struck by that when you thought of that phrase? Because I really found that very, very, productive in terms of taking the discourse forward.
Yes. The word ashram has multiple layers of meaning, particularly within Rabindranath's educational and community experiments. At one level, it refers to it refers to a place, the physical material space where Rabindranath had founded his spiritual retreat, and where Rabindranath later founded his Brahmacharya Ashram. And that is roughly the place which has been now recognized as the World Heritage Site. But on a more abstract level, the word ashram also refers to the collective identity of the community. The word ashram and all the connotations it carries, it denotes the collective identity of the community. And it is not just a physical space, a material space, but also a conceptual space that exists, as you pointed out, which exists in the minds of those who believe in its foundational values. So in order to be an ashramik, you don't need to be physically present in Santiniketan or Suniketan. So it's an idea which is sometimes looked at from a perspective tinged with nostalgia. Sometimes it is seen as an idea which is which has the possibility of becoming the possibility of becoming restored, something that that still has relevance. But in any case, it's a set of values. It's an idea that is articulated through a number of ways, not just through memories, but also through aspirations, through art, through architecture, through memoirs, through memories. So, jethay mori ghure se je jay na kobhu dure. This ashram, the subject matter of the so-called ashram shongit, is certainly something that is not just a place. It's an emotion. It's an idea that exists in the imagination, in the collective consciousness of the community, or those, or a set of individuals. It's not easy to say whether such a community still exists now, but it may be present in the minds of people who have never been to Santiniketan. So its boundaries are extremely fluid. Right.
And that makes me wonder, I think it's Leela Gandhi who perhaps used the term affective community. Yes. So the other, spot on, the other phrase that you cite, as it were, you quote and borrow from Rabindranath, is Chitto Samobai. And I think I made a Freudian slip earlier this morning, when I was talking to you over the phone, and that just shows how, in many ways, Anglophone and, if you like, Eurocentric my own vocabulary still tends to be, and how that colors how I instinctively, even in passing, kind of think of the community to be. Because I was thinking about Sir Thomas More's Utopia, which is built around, you see, a kind of a homogenized economy, a barter system. So by Samobai, and you might be able to perhaps help me with the etymology there, versus Samobai, which is the mistake that I made, was when I reflected upon it later, it was quite revealing to me in terms of exposing my own assumptions and biases. So this book has been extraordinary in terms of how it's helped me in many ways decolonize my own mind. So, but to get back to the idea of the affective community, since you use the word Chitto Samobai, but you translate it right after as a knowledge cooperative or a cooperative of minds, even as the values that you often kind of then go on to enumerate are those of generosity, those of sacrifice and service and sharing and open-heartedness. So why would you call it simply a Samobai of minds as opposed to hearts? Or is that, how would Rabindranath have seen that dynamic between in Chitto itself as a term?
Yes. I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that Chitto means both mind and heart, because Visva-Bharati was meant to be a cooperative of minds, the idea was to initiate a dialogue between different cultures and collectivities. But we need to remember that this was not just an unidirectional movement away from nationalism to internationalism, because Visva-Bharati remained grounded in a very firm notion of selfhood and self-respect. The idea was that India needed to participate in the production of knowledge. India needed to rediscover and reclaim its own cultural inheritance, and that it could regain its self-respect by sharing that inheritance with the world. So, so this is where the idea of a transaction comes in. India, the West needs India's spiritual wisdom, which Rabindranath persistently believed had ethical relevance because of its emphasis on certain values like unity and inclusivity and pluralism and syncretism. At the same time, he also thought that India needed the West's scientific rationality. So this is the idea of a transaction which is prominently present in certain essays, for example, the Union of Cultures. But this was not just a mechanical process of transaction between two cultures. It was also a densely emotional process where the different cultures and collectivities would experiment with new forms of friendship. So that is why the idea of the community became so important during the Visva-Bharati phase.
Friendship as opposed to kinship.
Yes.
In the anthropological sense, kinship.
Yes. But he was constantly searching for a
spiritual
kinship.
Yes. As opposed to blood kinship.
As opposed to blood kinship or racial kinship or religious kinship. A certain kind of spiritual kinship that would bring all human beings together. And that is why in his writings on Visva-Bharati, principles like friendship and hospitality are emphasized repeatedly. So in fact, one of the essays, one of the lectures on Visva-Bharati is titled "The Guest House of India." And he meant Visva-Bharati to be an exemplary space where at an individual level, representatives of different cultures would come to know each other and become friends, because that experiment would show that such transgressions of national and racial and religious boundaries were possible, both in the domain of knowledge, because it's interesting to remember that Syed Mujtaba Ali writes that when he joined Visva-Bharati as a student of Islamic studies, he was also given a chance to study a very eclectic range of subjects, including Vedanta philosophy and Italian literature. So this mingling of minds was taking place on the one hand in the domain of knowledge, and it was also taking place in the domain of in the domain of the community, where we can talk about Shlomit Flaum, the Jewish woman who came to Santiniketan, and she began to see Santiniketan as her home, and she felt that she has always been a part of this community. So both in terms of exchanging knowledge and in terms of a very personal, emotional process, this Chitta Samobhaya was being built up, was being experimented with.
In that context, in course of your analysis, you do draw attention to the challenges that the praxis, as it were, the translation of the idea into practice posed to Rabindranath. The particular episode that you cite around Kunjalal Ghosh, the casteism that he had to initially perhaps negotiate in conciliatory ways before eventually creating a space that was more authentically inclusive, shall we say. So it's experimental in that sense too. It's evolving. The inclusivity itself, as it were, was something that was in progress, a project in progress. I found it very, I think it was very honest of you as a researcher to kind of create a space, a critical, critical distance for yourself, in contrast to the kind of uncritical, almost hagiographic elements that you do register or recognize in some of the memoirs. One of the things that you so astutely point out is that the memoirs are such a rich kind of corpus of memories and reminiscences and of perhaps even a lot of information. Having said that, only a few really seem to have been written from a certain kind of critical distance. So that is where you come in. I just, perhaps if this is not too controversial, because I'm sure you've been thinking about it, what about the place of the Adivasis in that understanding of inclusivity? Is that something that he has written about? We know about songs, we know about his poetry, Shautali Chele or Shautali Me, but in terms of creating that larger community, what were his thoughts and what were the challenges, if any?
As you pointed out, the boundaries of the community were constantly becoming wider and wider. So something that began as an experiment with a new kind of spiritual relationship between the guru and the pupil, soon extended itself to include the natural environment, for example, and later the villages and the world, from the home to the world. The Adivasis, Santiniketan, from the early years of the Brahmacharya Ashram, there was a desire to connect with, there was a desire to interact with the villages surrounding Santiniketan. The students of the Brahmacharya Ashram used to go and teach the boys in the villages. It is not quite easy to say whether the Adivasis were visibly present as a part of the project. They were visibly present through Ramkinkaur's sculptures, for instance, the Santal family. But since I haven't come across any memoir written by any member of the Adivasi community who came into close contact with Santiniketan, it is difficult to identify sources that can be used to, in a way, literally point out the relationship between Santiniketan and the tribal communities, because they were still not in a position to participate in the discourse. It may be the story of Santiniketan may be present in memoirs, in memories, but they were still not in a position to speak out, record their memories. So, I think it's an important. It can be an important project. There is a possibility that one can work on this and find more significant details about this Santiniketan's relationship, its evolving relationship with the surrounding tribal villages. There are references in memoirs written by others. Lila Majumdar, for example, describes her experience of going to the villages. Chitranibha Chaudhuri also talks about it. But the Santals themselves did not have the voice, unfortunately, at that point of time, or at least they did not speak through our language. So it may be an interesting project to try to retrieve the lost memories, to retrieve those voices. That would be a very interesting idea, I think.
And so apt of you to bring the discussion round to the woman question, and what better occasion and what better day to do it on than today. So since you have taken, you took time to develop your, perhaps your understanding of the Tagorean vision for women in particular, or ashram kunna, you mentioned that phrase. How do you see, that's a personal curiosity to somebody who grew up here and who's the daughter of, I believe, an ashram kunna too, in perhaps more ways than one, and somebody who served the institution and the learning space. So the Santiniketan woman, how would you, I'm not asking for a definition, hardly. What would your, as it were, how would you conceptualize an ashram kunna in the time of the ashram community, perhaps in Tagore's own lifetime or afterwards, and now?
Let me begin by sharing a memory. My aunt, my mother's elder sister, was a gifted artist and a dancer. And she was extremely fond of walking on stilts. So she used to go to school and later to the college walking on stilts. So that was a spectacle that was quite normal in Santiniketan, but it would have been frowned upon in some other place. I'm talking about the early 50s. So Santiniketan, yes, it created a certain kind of space where it was possible for women to do things that would have been otherwise considered as taboo. Rabindranath's own position on women was slightly, complex, because it was a mixture of both conservatism and liberal thinking. So in some of his non-fictional writings like Stri Shikha, he says certain things that may now sound a bit conservative. For example, he seems to believe in a certain notion of gender difference, and he says that for women, education should have a different set of priorities. Since women are temperamentally and biologically different, they should get an education that should help them become women, which has to be different from the education that is meant for men. And he also associated femininity with certain qualities like tolerance, the willingness to serve, compassion, hospitality, beauty. So he had inherited certain...
Which may not be found in women alone.
Yes, absolutely. So that is why he sometimes evokes in his writings, non-fictional writings, for example, he evokes certain ideas of gender roles and differences that may sound to be essentialist. But Rabindranath's own understanding of the issue was it had certain ambiguities, and it was marked by a certain kind of ambivalence, because in his works of fiction, he portrays a number of strong-willed women who challenge patriarchal norms, who challenge patriarchal stereotypes of womanhood through the choices they make. For example, Mrinal in Street Potro, Chitrangada, for instance. So there were certain contradictions and ambiguities in what Rabindranath thought, or how Rabindranath was trying to conceptualize the ashram women. But I think that the ashram women managed to transgress all the boundaries that are imposed by stereotypes.
We took some questions from the learned audience, and I'm so happy to see our students here, delighted to perhaps be liaising, as it were, between Visva-Bharati's present and I was not going to say Visva-Bharati's past, far from it. So questions, please.
Thank you for this wonderful conversation. I just had two observations and queries also. Like you talked about Jagadish Chandra Bosu's letters, and you also talked about the metaphor of a tree organically growing. So today morning I was reading something about like how Alexander von Humboldt influenced Henry David Thoreau in like balancing the philosopher, essayist, and the naturalist. So like how they come together in him. So like I want to know how like for Rabindranath, the poet and the naturalist comes together, because like what you talked about your like lived experience and how much I know like Patho's curriculum till includes Prakriti Path. But he said like he is very fascinated by his work and how he is interested in the tribals, and he like Alvin felt that the administration and the policies for tribal areas, if it were made by poets and artists, that would have been much better. Like it's a very interesting observation. So, like, do you think like our ashram could have incorporated tribals which still lives in our fringes in a better way, or there are limitations? Like, how do you think that? Again, thank you so much. Although I grew up here. I'm from Chicago and English. I have studied in Department of English for my graduation and masters. So yeah, that's.
Thank you, Shraddindu. These are two very interesting questions. For Rabindranath, nature was not just something that had to be viewed scientifically, but also something that had a spiritual connection with his own sense of being. As someone who had read and interpreted the Vedantic notion of universal unity, Rabindranath believed that we all are parts of a single universal unity. So all living beings, everything in the universe, are spiritually one with each other because of their common participation in entity that the Upanishad calls Brahma. So for Rabindranath, there was no conflict, there was no contradiction between nature as something, as a spiritual presence, something that was closely connected to his own being as a poet, as a thinker, but also nature as something that needed to be understood through science and scientific rationality. So there was no boundary between Rabindranath the poet and Rabindranath who also understood science and had a keen interest in science. I'm also glad that you mentioned Verrier Elvin. Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's difficult to respond to the question in a substantial manner as to whether during the first 4 decades of the 20th century, the people of the tribal communities living in surrounding villages participated in the experimental community. But certainly now at least, members of the tribal community have become a part of the institutional network. They have become a part of the community of students and teachers. But this is something that needs to be researched in further detail. Okay, it's an interesting question, and I suggest that why don't you do this research?
Incidentally, he didn't mention the fact that he's now a PhD scholar in digital humanities at IIT Dhanbad.
Congratulations.
Sukalyan, my question is, you were talking about communities that are people who belong to the community but are not part of Santiniketan as a space. So I was wondering if I can get certain names or memoirs or some other write-ups where some people or Rabindranath is speaking about or referencing to people whom he used to consider as ashramite, but who never had been here, who had never lived here, or were never part of Santiniketan, the space itself. The first question. Second question is, what was Tagore's idea of how the community in this space would emerge or evolve? Because Santiniketan, as I understand, is a very small place and it's not a very hospitable place. It had not been when it started. So what was his idea of how the place would emerge in terms of as a living space where people would come and live, especially the ashramites?
Refer to Buddhadev Boshu, for instance. I hope it's working. Buddhadev Boshu, who wrote a remarkable account of his visits to Santiniketan in the early 1941. So, Buddhadev Boshu can be seen as one who does not live in Santiniketan. He is not a part of the physical place that is Santiniketan, but he, as someone who is completely ideologically aligned with its foundational values, not just its artistic experiments, but also its work on rural reconstruction and so on. So Buddhadev Boshu's memoir, Shobpechi Deshe, can be seen as a remarkable example of someone from outside looking at Santiniketan as his own space. Rabindranath does not mention individuals, saying that he does not live in Santiniketan, but he is a part of the community. But he, in the lectures he delivered in China, for example, he says that you can become a part of the ashram by accepting its ideals, its values. So the idea that it is possible to become a part of the community without being physically present in Santiniketan or Sriniketan was definitely present in his understanding of the place. Whether that idea has been translated into a reality is a different question, that something that you can answer in your own way as a present student who is living in Santiniketan 80, 90 years after Rabindranath's death. But we have to understand that the very fact that this principle was being cherished, the very fact that this principle was being articulated at a time when communal disharmony and large-scale wars were going on throughout the world. 1934, just before the Second World War, just a few years before the partition. So the very fact that this idea was prominently present in the collective consciousness of the ashram community is something that needs to be remembered, something that needs to be revived in some way or other.
So my question is, what has been the fate of the project in the decades after Tagore's time and up to and including the present? The discussion has alluded to it at various points, and you mentioned that it's a broad and complex question to answer. But and you've talked about the ideal and the philosophical kind of thinking behind the project as well as its reality during the time of its establishment and soon after. But how has the project evolved, and what has been its kind of journey, or any thoughts on that up to the present?
For example, in one talk that was delivered in the Mandir, the Upasana Mandir, he says that I know that you are no longer ready to accept the core values of this ashram, but you have to acknowledge the strenuous journey that has created this space. So the process of ideological realignment, the process of ideological change had already begun, but it accelerated after Rabindranath's death, after 1951, when Visva-Bharati became a university under the central government. In 1953, Rabindranath Tagore left Santiniketan. He left his position as Vice Chancellor. And increasingly it was felt by the ashramics that Visva-Bharati was being transformed into a conventional university. Even in 1980s and 90s, when I was growing up, the prevalent opinion, the complaint, was that Santiniketan was increasingly becoming a conventional university, with its emphasis on examinations, and so on. So perhaps these changes have been inevitable, but the fact that I believe that its core values have survived, if not within an institutional framework, at least within the minds of some individuals. And that is how the ashram has survived. That is how the ashram can live on. Through individuals, through the other experimental institutions that were established in other parts of the country or the other parts of the world. It lives on through these exceptional individuals. Some of them, in fact, are present here today. Some of those individuals who believe in Santiniketan's values are present here today. And through these individuals and through the other experimental institutions and through people who are not even aware of Rabindranath or Santiniketan, but are fighting for the ideals and values he cherished, through these individuals, Santiniketan will live on.
Assuming there aren't any further questions, it's been an absolute delight speaking to you. And I kept remembering Rabindranath, a favorite poet of Rabindranath's, Matthew Arnold, and his concept of sweetness and light as the desired ideals. And there would have been, there could have been, a few other points for perhaps extended discussion. That one would be the concept of the guru, and in the context of Arnold, the idea of religiosity and its intersections with. But that's something we can defer for a later conversation. And more importantly, I think we should leave some discoveries, as it were, or scope for discoveries. I'm sure there'll be plenty for those who are going to read the book, and I urge everyone here to do so, everyone who has not already read it. So on that note, thank you so much. And let me take this occasion to thank Atreyu and Suresh Romeo Memorial Trust. It's humbling, it's a privilege to be back here after a brief hiatus. I think my journey began in 2018, and it would be amiss not to extend my gratitude to Professor Shivakumar, who had initially, or who had introduced Shudev and me to the organizers, and we've been part of the journey since. So it's been absolutely wonderful coming back, and my gratitude to everybody at SAMT and to the audience here. Thank you very much.